Hi, everybody. This is Arlo Gilbert, co-founder and CEO of Osano, a leading data privacy management platform. And you are listening to the Privacy Insider Podcast. This show explores the past, present, and future of data privacy for privacy and business leaders alike, as well as anyone who wants to keep privacy top of mind. Hi, everybody. This is Arlo Gilbert. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Osano, a leading data privacy company. And this is the first episode of the Privacy Insider Podcast. Today, we are joined by Katharine Tomko. Katharine is a partner at First Ascent Ventures and a Series B investor in Osano. But more importantly than that, Katharine has an incredible background when it comes to data privacy. She had a pivotal role at Facebook where she was super early, if not the first privacy person there, which I have so many questions about, and I'm sure you have so many stories that we probably couldn't fit them all into this podcast. But now Katharine is over at First Ascent Ventures, where she is leading investments in B2B software companies. We're very grateful that she chose to invest in Osano because her background and her privacy was really just extraordinary, and it got me very excited. Plus, she's a wonderful person and nice to hang out with. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about Katharine's background, how she got into privacy, including stuff about her family and her grandparents, and this all harkens back to her time in Czechoslovakia. I do think that one thing that is really interesting that's been happening in privacy lately is that we notice, whether it's customers or whether it's at conventions or whether I'm talking to a friend on the pod, we all have some personal story that has really kind of driven us to privacy. I certainly have my own, but Katharine has a really interesting background. So Katharine, welcome to the podcast. We are just so happy to have you.
I am just so thrilled to be here. Thank you, Arlo.
Yeah. So why don't we start off and maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself. I hope I did a good job of introducing you, but I know the audience would love to understand, what did you do at Facebook and just maybe a little bit of a background on yourself.
You did a nice job of introducing me, but I will add a little bit more color. So I joined Facebook in 2008. My desire was to work on privacy issues. And sort of when we dig into why I ultimately decided to specialize in privacy and data protection, we can kind of get a little bit more into the history of ultimately why I wanted so badly to work on privacy issues at Facebook. But when I joined the company, privacy was not looked at in the way that it is looked at today. So while I desperately wanted to work on privacy issues, the privacy issues that were hacked accounts, Nigerian scammers, content moderation, figuring out how to get porn off the site. So while it was incredibly interesting work, it was not the work that I so desperately wanted to do around what is the data strategy? How are we collecting information? How are we being transparent with users about it? How do we educate our employee base on why this is important? So I kind of noodled around various roles. I ended up building out Facebook payments. We wanted to have a product called Facebook Credits, and in order to do so, we needed to have a subsidiary called Facebook Payments. So I became a certified anti-money laundering specialist and figured out how one could potentially launder money through Farmville and a lot of interesting stuff like that. It was not till 2011 when Facebook was hit with the FTC consent order that it was finally alrighty, now we actually are being forced to look at privacy very holistically as a company. Go and do that. Now, again, super fascinating. Building a privacy program at a company like Facebook, and probably one of the first privacy programs in the world, was incredibly interesting, incredibly challenging, figuring out the risk assessments, etc. But it was ultimately too late. I mean, it was here's a high-speed moving train that has already left the station. We have near 1 billion passengers on the train. Now go and figure out how to add some brakes onto it. Really, really hard, which is why I ultimately left Facebook and thought, okay, I want to get into venture capital earlier stage because potentially now I have a little bit more influence of, hey, startups, you actually really need to be thoughtful about your privacy and data strategy early on.
Yeah, and I think that's a topic we should definitely touch on, because I think a lot of companies out there think that privacy is only something for the big companies, and they don't realize how foundational it is to building trust with their customers and making sure that their investors feel happy. Well, that's wild, though. So when you were at Facebook and that FTC order came in, I mean, you really didn't have something like the GDPR or the CPRA to provide guidance to you on how to formulate your program. How did you figure that out?
We leveraged the GAP principles. We sort of took those principles, did a massive risk assessment. So like the consent order was covered information. So it was ultimately, if a system or an individual touches user data, you need to evaluate the risk to that user data. But if you think about Facebook, like every single organization within Facebook had some sort of like touch point to covered information. So it was like literally like things like working with IT on how you deploy assets and ensure the assets are imaged properly, working with HR to ensure that they're not hiring someone who might be likely to commit corporate espionage. I would go to data centers. I went to Altoona, Iowa, and did okay, let's go find an unencrypted drive to pull and see how long it potentially would take the data center individuals to notice. I mean, it was a crazy experience. And I think that's the other thing when I speak to startups about privacy is I don't think they fully internalize that privacy touches every single organization within your company. I think a lot of people assume we will hire a privacy professional and they will just figure it out. They'll just make sure that we adhere to our privacy policy, but don't fully internalize, hey, it's HR, it's recruiting, it's your front-end code developers, back-end. I mean, literally every single organization.
That's amazing. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about your background, Katharine. I hope everybody can certainly see what I see. Said, wow, she's got amazing experience, and that's why I can't wait to have her as an investor. So let's talk a little bit more about your background. Why privacy? And we touched on the idea that personal stories were oftentimes the root of it. I know I have my own and things I'd done in a past life that probably weren't great data practice, but I'd love to hear yours.
I love that you admit to it. Same.
Oh, I was a bad actor. We didn't have any rules. There were, the internet was the Wild West.
Totally. I mean, 100%. I mean, I find a lot of people I meet who work in privacy. I'm like, why did you end up in privacy? And they were like, oh, we were a copyright lawyer. And then we got a case that had to do with data protection. So we thought, how interesting. That is not my journey. So my journey into specializing in privacy and data protection really stems from this profound understanding of the far-reaching consequences of privacy erosion on individuals, societies, and innovation. And this realization was very much nurtured by my upbringing, which was steeped in this environment where privacy advocacy was not just a profession, it was a family legacy. And in your book, you talk about the historical misuse of privacy rights. And you give this example around Stasi, Germany, which I hope everybody reads your book. It's fantastic. But that part of the book really resonated with me because my perspective on privacy is ultimately crystallized through the lens of my family history. So in the 1920s, my grandfather was jailed for 6 months for criticizing the president of Czechoslovakia. Now, the irony here, and it's something that I always say to folks in the West, in Canada and the US, because everyone's like, oh, we live in a democracy. That would never happen. Well, the 1920s in Czechoslovakia was a democracy, or so the citizens thought. So the president at the time, he had been a blacksmith, risen through the ranks, ultimately to the highest rank of president. My grandfather was at a bar with one of his friends, happened to make an offhanded comment about the president of Czechoslovakia, saying something to the effect of, hell, clearly it doesn't take brains to be president. I mean, if a blacksmith can become president, anyone can become president. He said to his friend, you could be president because you're way smarter than a blacksmith. Like totally innocuous, off the cuff. Unbeknownst to my grandfather, what he said was reported to the authorities, and he was jailed not long after. Like, there was no trial, there was no choice. They literally showed up at his door and threw him in jail. Now, this was the 1920s. 20 years later, Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, so my grandparents were forced to flee. And then 30 years after that, my father returned to Czechoslovakia. Now, by this time, so this is the 1970s, and I do have a point for bringing this up, so bear with me. So the country was under communist rule. Soviet troops occupied the country. So while in Slovakia, my father stayed with his relatives. Now, our family prior to the occupation, they were not poor individuals. They were into theater and the arts, etc. But after this occupation, my family ended up living in this 2-story wooden house where they had to keep livestock on the ground floor, and they lived on the second floor, and they ultimately harnessed the heat from the livestock to keep warm. But what struck my dad, like above and beyond the abject poverty that most people now lived under, was that when they went out in public, they all talked to each other in the whisper. Because people were absolutely terrified that someone was listening. And like many people would recount this story of this like elderly gentleman who used to go to the pub and like criticize the government, saying how corrupt and stupid they were. And he would give these speeches, and one night after one of his speeches, he went to walk home and he was never seen again. And people assumed that he was taken by the state authorities because people were constantly disappearing. Informers were everywhere. Now, there was this umbrella of fear that hovered over the people. Now, this fear was like kind of promoted by the government because they kept saying, oh, there's going to be an attack by the West. Although most people didn't actually believe that, the real threat were the informers. They were always listening and always reporting back on any infraction or incidents that they considered suspicious. So ultimately, this fear was exacerbated by a corrupt and paranoid government that misconstrued innocent, and I want to highlight innocent pieces of information to incorrectly brand individuals as enemies of the state. So when people were whispering, it was their way of protecting their privacy, although they probably didn't consider it like that. It was just ultimately their way of exercising freedom. And I like to say, whispering was ultimately their privacy-enhancing technology, as crude as that might seem and sound to us.
That is an amazing story. As I'm listening to that, and you're talking about the comment about the democracy, it's funny because we hear the same thing in America, right? Which is that this could never happen here, we're special, we're different. But you don't have to go that far back in time. I mean, think about McCarthyism, right? Where we were turning people in because, I suspect they might be a communist, and people's lives were ruined, and people were blacklisted from industries. It was a terrifying time. I think that's a point that we got to make sure folks understand and then share, which is that, being a democracy does not make immune from authoritarian behavior and from having your information and what you do and how you do it, who you talk to, being used against you in some way.
Yeah, and I think people also need to internalize informers are no longer sitting in bars listening in on you. They're no longer on the street. We have much more sophisticated digital informers. Literally everything you are putting online could potentially be misconstrued. It's almost like turnkey tyranny in a way.
Yeah, with the right data and the right intent, there's a lot of damage that somebody could do. I love hearing your story about Czechoslovakia and about your family's background. I have a better understanding now of what brought you into our world. I'm really curious, when you think about how things have changed since you were spending your time at Facebook, Have you seen a lot of big changes? I mean, it's kind of a loaded question. Obviously, we've had regulations, but I'm curious from your position, what's different? What's changed?
I mean, everything. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. So the pivotal moment for me where I was like, okay, I want to get into privacy arrived with the aftermath of 9/11. So you took 9/11 coupled with the enhancement of technology that made government one of the biggest vacuums of personal information for the purposes of public safety. And large tech companies sort of got corralled into this, followed by any company that started to collect personal information because of their migration from brick and mortar to online sales. So it became very clear to me the imperative of safeguarding public safety without sacrificing fundamental freedoms. And the emergence of digital surveillance as a sophisticated form of, like I said, electronic informers really highlighted the urgency of privacy advocacy in the face of evolving threats. So for me, I always just wanted to be an advocate of privacy. In university, I wrote my thesis on the topic of biometrics and whether or not they would eventually be used as tools of surveillance or tools of freedom. And in my paper, I talked about how one day there would be this centralized database that would know your likes, who your friends were, what you like to eat, where you like to go, whether you were happy, whether you were depressed. I actually got docked marks because my professor told me I was not grounded in reality. 4 years later, I did end up at the company, the one that I ultimately predicted. Now you ask, what are the most significant shifts? So many. I mean, if I look back at my time at Facebook, a lot of what they are getting raked over the coals for over the past few years, at the time didn't seem super controversial. It's like what you said. It was kind of the Wild West. People were ultimately making things up as they went along. And Facebook's mission was to make the world more open and connected. And how do you do that? You get people to share. But then Max Schrems happened. The Snowden revelations happened. Privacy by design became an international standard. Privacy Shield came into effect. Cambridge Analytica happened. The GDPR happened. CPRA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think from that, people's expectations of privacy and the desire to be informed about how Facebook was using their data started to shift and ultimately made their business model more and more difficult to justify over time, and also had a sweeping impact on any company that was collecting data.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like a lot of the regulations that we've seen proposed were aimed directly at Meta. But do you think that was the case? Do you think that looking at Facebook and saying, let's draft regulations and, they do this, let's go and to regulation that'll cover that?
It sure felt that way. I mean, the constant knock on the door from various regulators, and it was just this groundswell. I mean, you think Max Schrems, a law student who was like, hey, let me see if I can get my data from Facebook. Let's see, do they have a way for data portability? He didn't. And then you think now, subject access requests, if you are under a law or regulation that requires subject access requests, you need to have that in place. I feel like a lot of the laws and regulations, they looked at Facebook and thought, what have they done wrong? Let's try and build rules around that.
Wow. That is amazing. And, I think that as we think about human rights, and you talked about the whispering and the disappearance of people, I think we both agree that privacy is a foundational human right. You have the right to decide who knows what you're thinking and what you want to say. You have the right to control that distribution. And so I'm really curious, when you think about your experience across Facebook, Czechoslovakia, as a venture capital investor, how are you thinking about privacy and how are your beliefs around privacy keeping your investment theses?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. And I have to say, yes, I absolutely believe that privacy is a fundamental human right. I wonder how many people actually do, though. I wanted to kind of do a little test of like going around and saying to people, do you look at Facebook as a fundamental human right? Because I kind of feel like if you look at fundamental human rights, so for example, the right to life is like, well, don't kill me. So we are not generally having people go out and just killing people because everyone understands, well, no, that's a human right. But then you look at privacy and I always think, gosh, like, where did we go wrong with respect to communicating that privacy is a fundamental human right? I mean, just look at the countries where privacy was eroded. Czechoslovakia, for example, like, not a joyous society anymore, not a creative society anymore. When you're like living under fear and you don't trust anyone, you can't engender a creative, joyful, innovative society. It impacts individuals spiritually, psychologically, financially, etc. So for me, and I ultimately left the in-house world of privacy and very strategically thought, if I can get into venture capital where we do have a little bit more ability to say, well, when we do diligence on you as a company, we actually want to see, is the founding team considerate of privacy? Like, do they even think about it? Do they understand generally what privacy means? How do they think about their data strategy? Do they have a data strategy? Now, is there an expectation at the stage of company that we invest in to have a fully robust privacy program? No, not necessarily. Do I long for the day that there is one? Yes, I mean, absolutely. But little by little. So I think in terms of our investment or my investment strategy is we do spend time doing diligence on these companies to really get a sense of how founders are thinking through privacy. And if they're not, probably not the right companies for us.
So then you're definitely taking privacy and you're kind of using it as a way to look at the ethical approach that the business is taking to understand if this is a business that you want to be part of. And it seems like that's a growing trend, not necessarily in VC, but consumers care, businesses care, employees care, and it really feels like it's a matter of time till privacy is just part of the diligence process. You know, it may not be deep and might not be 100 pages, but it might very well be. We need to go and look at third parties and understand who you're sharing data with before we give you millions of dollars.
Absolutely. And when I talk to other VCs, they're interested in privacy. I think it's because privacy from an outside perspective seems so complicated and so confusing as to where to even start. I think it's less about, do they care, and more about like, we just don't really know what to do. I do think the tide is shifting a little bit, especially now with the push around AI. Investors are like, oh shoot, actually, if we are going to invest in a company that is leveraging AI, we know that data is a big part of that. And we need to make darn sure that the company understands what data they're using. So I do think there are going to be more frameworks that come out with respect to, hey, investor, leverage this framework to understand the responsible AI that this potential target company is thinking about.
I'm hopeful, at least, that that is one of the little ways that privacy makes its way into being more mainstream, right? Because VCs tend to be on the bleeding edge of technology and trends, and they lead. So I'm hopeful that we'll start seeing more of this from insurers, from banks. Do we want to give you a cyber insurance policy if you are willy-nilly sharing personal data and maybe at risk of some sort of fine or worse, right? There could be some class actions against you if there's a breach. So I certainly hope that that's where things go.
I agree. And I hope that privacy becomes a line item on the budget.
Yes, me too. Me too. Well, Katharine, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know the audience is going to appreciate it. Our team at Osano appreciates it. and we're really looking forward to having you on another episode. So I hope that you have a wonderful day. As a takeaway for the audience, when we think about the intersection of technology and human rights, they really play a critical role in defining how we are going to go forward as a society. We have an opportunity as small participants in this gigantic puzzle of regulation and data to have an impact. Katharine shared some great insights about her background at Facebook, her family's history in Czechoslovakia. And in our next episode, we are going to chat some more with Katharine about the challenges and opportunities that are currently happening in relation to privacy regulations and the ethical use of AI. These are really interesting and complicated topics. We're going to try very hard to simplify it. And Katharine, we are looking forward to continuing having you on episode 2.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arlo. This has been fantastic.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Privacy Insider Podcast. You can find a full transcript of this episode and any show notes at osano.com. That's www.osano.com. And while you're there, get access to an excerpt of my book, The Privacy Insider: How to Embrace Data Privacy and Join the Next Wave of Trusted Brands, which is now available on Amazon for purchase. Until next month, take care. And remember, data privacy is a fundamental human right, y'all.